Hello, everybody, and welcome. And I hope you can hear me. I've just unmuted, and so somebody raise their hands if they can't. Great. So we're here today to discuss mutant algorithms and to kind of ask the question whether it's really the algorithm's fault or whether they're just simply a scapegoat for politics and wider systemic issues. And really what we want to do here together is to kind of figure out where we stand on the issue and what really are these wider systemic problems. So just to set the stage for a minute, I think all of us here today are aware about the increasingly powerful role that algorithmic systems, whether that's kind of AI infused machine learning or all the way down to sort of risk assessments that are more simple, statistics powered models, the role that they play in our lives. We've seen it in our private lives when it comes to entertainment and adverts and education, but also they're becoming increasingly more ubiquitous in the public sector. We're just coming off from a panel about the use of algorithms in policing, for example, but we've also seen examples of this in the way that student grades are allocated or benefit fraud is spotted, and public resources are being allocated. So the question, the reason we're discussing this today is that the only time we really start to talk about these algorithms is when they go wrong, and that's actually only when we hear about them. And I think that might be a problem in itself, which we can discuss. Most people don't know that they're subject to an algorithm until they go wrong. And the question we kind of want to ask here is, are we just blaming the algorithm, the technology? Is that the easy option? Or are there wider systemic issues, including political decision making or the lack of, and implementation issues? And how then do we balance these two things to make sure that, to make sure that algorithmic decision making can actually be useful, if at all, and also how it can actually instill the necessary skepticism that is needed amongst the public when we're subject to these systems. So I'm going to turn over to our panel here to introduce themselves, to tell us who they are, not so much a bio, but kind of what do you do and why are algorithms, particularly in the public sector, important to you? Just to set the stage here, and we'll then, after you kind of tell us who you are, have some opening remarks from each of you. But let's get started with Gillian.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Gillian Docherty. I am CEO of the Data Lab, Scotland's Innovation Centre for Data Science and AI, and I'm also chair of Scotland's AI Alliance Leadership Circle, which is responsible for helping to guide the implementation of the recommendations in Scotland's AI strategy.
Thank you, Gillian. Gavin, do you want to tell us a little bit about you?
Thank you, and afternoon, everyone. I'm Gavin Freegard. I'm a freelance consultant working on various things to do with data, open government, and digital, particularly around the public sector. I was programme director at the Institute for Government, which is all about making government more effective. So my interest in algorithms, especially when it comes to the public sector, is where they can be used to make government and all of our lives better, but also making sure that they do that in an open, transparent way, which doesn't lead to harm.
Great. Thank you. Hiten, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Hiten Shah, Chief Exec at the British Academy, which is the UK's National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences. So, of course, those disciplines have got a lot to say about the way that society is structured and the role of data within it. But I've got two other hats as well. One is I'm Vice Chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is looking at using data and AI for public good, and as an independent institution housed at the Nuffield Foundation. And then finally, I'm on the board of the Legal Education Foundation, and in particular involved in the work that its Justice Lab does, looking at how we use data in the context of the justice system.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And David, last but not least.
Sure, yes. I'm David Leslie. I'm the ethics lead at the Alan Turing Institute, which is Great Britain's National Data Science and Artificial Intelligence Institute. I guess you could say I kind of eat, sleep, breathe, dream algorithms insofar as our work really crosses between advising public sector on sort of best practices and gold standards for the governance of algorithmic systems. But also we do a lot of work in studying the social and ethical impacts of data-driven and algorithmic systems in society. And so we straddle between academic research and public policy.
Great, thank you. So just to throw open the first sort of question, and then each of you can take it in turns and as kind of your opening gambit, just to set the scene. But what have you all noticed, you know, increasingly examples of or use of algorithms and stories around algorithms in political discourse in recent years? Has that changed over time? And kind of, I'd just like you to talk about how algorithms have become part of the political and public conversation and how you've seen that change with examples of you. Who would like to go first? Jump in.
I'll happily contribute first. Yeah. I think more broadly in society, the use of data and then subsequently the use of AI and algorithms has significantly increased over the last 5 or 6 years. The Data Lab has existed for around seven years or so, and the difference now to when it first started, there is a much higher level of discussion, debate and awareness in society and in the public more broadly than there was 7 or 8 years ago. And unfortunately, a lot of that has been guided by several major global issues, whether that's the social media, Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal, the implementation of GDPR more broadly, and then more recently over the last couple of years, you know, the word of algorithms has come into the public lexicon a little bit more than it did before. So it's certainly there's much more awareness, there's much more discussion, and there's certainly I'm more popular at parties now than I used to be for people asking what this is all about. And in terms of its role in public discourse and does it give, you know, is it used as a shall we say, a catch-all for political excuses? I think it's like anything else. I think if our politicians are held to account and they need to and they wish to, you know, I guess blame certain things on other actors, technology, algorithms, it's just another way for them to use that. I don't think it's algorithms specifically. I think actually if our politicians are unscrupulous to a certain extent, they can use a variety of things to blame reasons for activity or otherwise on. So I don't think it stands out in terms of other areas that they can use or blame, but I do think it is more publicly discussed, more publicly aware, and actually we need to hold everyone from politicians to those in public office and indeed our industry and third sector to account for the algorithms that they use to support us as citizens, as clients, as patients or otherwise.
Okay, thanks Gillian. Shall we go next to Gavin?
Thank you very much. Obviously, I agree with an awful lot of what Gillian's just said. I think one of the political words of this year, certainly to those of us who are obsessive sort of Westminster and watchers of other parliaments in the UK, has been cut through. As in these stories about corruption and standards in politics at the moment, these multiple stories about corruption and standards in politics at the moment haven't cut through with a person on the street or in a Clapham omnibus or in this constituency which has a by-election. Therefore, do they matter and should we continue to report them? I think if there was any doubt on the cut through about the political standards front, that's been removed by the events of the last week. But I think it shows that the fact that those stories might not have cut through didn't mean that important things weren't happening. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about them. It didn't mean that certain groups weren't paying attention to them, starting to uncover and solve the problems. And I think algorithms in decision-making was probably in a similar place until last summer. They were becoming more and more prevalent in public life and in elsewhere. We perhaps weren't noticing them while they didn't do anything obviously affecting the general public, and while we weren't really thinking of it as a subject to be thought about. And then, of course, last summer, we had the exam fiasco, Arago farce, whatever you want to call it. So even if the public knew a bit about algorithms in theory, maybe the odd news article here and there, maybe a bit of awareness about how they were being used to curate content on social media, tell us what to watch next on Netflix or what to buy on Amazon, it was when you had something like the A-level exam story where people's lives were actually being affected, that it suddenly cut through. And again, people like us may have been thinking about it, may have known a bit more about it. Recruitment algorithms, the work of ProPublica and others in the States looking at the use of algorithms in the justice system over there. But I think it was the A-level algorithm that sort of changed the game. I think that the main point, especially when it comes to political discourse, that I would want to make, and again, I think this echoes Gillian, is that blaming the algorithm as if it's some shadowy, omniscient, omnipotent, independent actor in its own right is really easy for politicians and private companies to do. And of course, it's extremely wrong. The decision to use an algorithm in decision-making in the first place, the algorithm itself, the wider socio-technical system in which those algorithms operate, all of those things are made by humans. They are choices on behalf of individuals, governments, of companies, and it's right that they're the ones that are held accountable and responsible for that. Yes, there are things in the design of the algorithm, obviously, which will make them better or worse, more useful, less useful. But again, those design decisions, the decision to use it in the first place, are all sort of made by humans. Could go on for much longer. And just to say a few other quick things in passing. First of all, I think the use of algorithms is sort of a symptom of wider tech solutionism. I think the attraction of using shiny technology to solve political problems is quite a strong one, even when it's not clear that they actually do that. In the case of the A-level algorithm, I think it also elevated something which could have been useful as part of the system. Moderation statistical methods have been used for years when it comes to assessing exam grades, but elevating that to the whole system itself, which gives you a really sort of big single point of failure. And in terms of the discourse of how we do hold people to account and hold people responsible for this, obviously there's a need for much more transparency, explanation, public engagement about how algorithms are used. We need to start talking to the public in a language that everyone can understand about why they matter, how they affect us, what's behind them, and as well as that transparency and explainability, making sure that there are redress mechanisms in place should people be affected in the way that they clearly were last summer. And hopefully all of those things will help us move beyond kind of algorithms are bad, mutant, or algorithms are great and will solve everything, and actually have the interesting conversations that we need to have in the sort of grey area in between.
Thank you so much. I want to go to David next. So I think both Gillian and Gavin have said, it's very easy to blame the algorithm, but as Gavin put it, there are humans that along the entire chain of, of an algorithm, including starting at the very beginning, the decision to actually use it, and then how it's implemented. But I'm curious, David, talking about, the algorithms themselves, do you think there is still a lack of understanding within government and others who are implementing these systems that result in this poor decision making, and then that result in the harms that come out of algorithms? Because yes, I think the issues are two separate things. I think first, I would be curious to know from you, as somebody who studies this on the technical side, is there a problem with actually understanding algorithms before we implement them within these organizations that are doing it, and is that partly the reason we're in this position?
So yeah, I mean, I would just initially say that there's been a process of unlearning that has had to happen over the past decade or so, whereby for quite a while, when we thought about algorithms, being used in the public sector or elsewhere, there was a kind of patina of objectivity or neutrality that came along with the use of a kind of technical system. And I think that what that's meant in some cases in both public and private sector use is that there is a tendency to just rely on it as a technological system, what Gavin referred to as a kind of solutionist perspective, that just kind of did shift the onus of any sort of responsibility onto the underlying technical machinery of the algorithm. So that it is some sort of decision procedure that is run on computational hardware, that there was this kind of tendency to just lean on that story in order to avoid this kind of entry point of human choice, which is something that we need to be quite aware of, not just in the decision to use algorithmic systems, but also we can think of it across the entire life cycle. So the way that say a public sector body that's using algorithms will determine the target variable. So what the problem that's being solved is how to define that, and how to come up with a statistical way to measure and define that target. Also thinking about decisions made and as we pre-process data that's going to train the algorithm. So how we group variables together, and other decisions we make about which models to choose, and how to tune those models, the parameters of those models. So there's an entire complex world of socio-technical decisions that are being made, and getting to a point where we have people in government being able to sort of engage that complex environment in a reflective and active way, rather than being passive kind of developers of technology, say, is something that will increasingly, I think, happen. And I think we've come some distance towards having that type of awareness, but we're clearly not there yet. I mean, the off-qual example that Gavin referred to before is just a kind of, I think, a very good illustration of how if you have public sector users, say, that aren't alive to these issues that have been sort of that had become part of other parts of government that are, more aware of it. If you have parts of government that are on the back foot, say, then you will have these terrible events happen where the way that we see algorithms is an entirely negative way, because we hear about them when things go wrong, but not necessarily when things are going right. And I would also, in this way, just say, if you watch closely at what happened with the off-qual situation, and you watch the protests, the students and others who are out protesting, screaming expletives at the algorithm, there was I would say a really keen awareness of some of the socio-technical issues out in the public world, and in the engagement of people in this domain, showed that we have some degree and manner of sophistication, which lends to the need for public consent and social license, because people do understand these systems as being socio-technical systems that have the potential for bias and discrimination as part of the whole life cycle.
Thank you. Hiten, do you want to jump in there? And, feel free to also kind of, introduce your opening gambit, but also if you could also kind of look at what are these wider systemic issues or political issues that play into algorithms going wrong. So kind of the other side of the coin from what David talked about, not so much the technical, but more the socio part of it. That would be great to get some examples as well.
Yeah, thanks, Madhu. Let me start by just saying, I think, with the topic of how far have algorithms entered the public discourse, I would slightly disagree with colleagues as to how far this is really on the public radar. I think people like us who come to conferences to discuss this year on year, we kind of vastly overestimate actually the level of public salience on some of this stuff. So I think if you were to ask most members of the public, the word algorithm is pretty meaningless, as it were. And why should they take an interest? Most of us in our day-to-day lives, we care about, how are our kids doing at school, or what's happening to the health system. We don't think in terms of a cross-cutting issue like AI or algorithm or data, as it were. So that's left for us policy geeks. But I would say that the salience of these issues for what you might call the sort of decision-making elite, particularly in the policy community, has really risen up the agenda. But they've not been thinking about these as mutants. I would characterize it as they think of it as magic. And that is with all the sort of scariness that magic brings, really. It's a kind of black box. You just think somehow the algorithm resolves everything. And it's what, colleagues on the panel have been talking about in terms of sort of techno-optimism, as it were. And looking back at off-qual, I think that was a really interesting example where David was saying the public sort of got involved, but the algorithm itself did what it always said it would do on the tin. The algorithm didn't go wrong, but Ofqual itself had underestimated how, in particular, the outliers. So it worked in many of the cases, but there were, let's say 5% of the cases where somebody who had been predicted an A then got an E because of the algorithm, and in effect it was using school grades and it just coming out in completely the wrong place. This is where the lack of human intervention was very important. They didn't catch those cases. But then what was interesting is when humans then sort of fought back, obviously it was the sort of, I'm a bright kid in a poor school and my grades haven't come out where they should have done. They were really good cases, but then probably slightly less worthy cases sort of jumped on the back of that. I'm a kid who was predicted an A. I got a B. It's all gone wrong. So actually, even the way that the humans have sort of protested in all of this, it's not necessarily that the humans were right and the algorithm was wrong. Not that you can sort of caricature it in that way, but humans also are vested interests sort of pushing for their own sort of desires within a system. And that is your point, I think, Madhu, about what's the political reality within which all of this operates. And so my starting point for all of this is always, what's the kind of society we're trying to create? And then therefore, how do we use these technological or data-driven tools to get us there? And the question is always, who is acting with what interests, who has the power? In this particular case, who has the data? So if the technology companies are holding the data, and civil society or academic researchers aren't able to access it or get hold of it, then it's not always clear that the things that are being done with these algorithmic systems are going to be in the public interest. So those are the sort of big questions. And one of the issues, I think, is in this space. As I say, most people are not very interested. It's not that interesting. we don't want to spend time thinking about, what are the best mechanisms for making an algorithm transparent. Sorry, David, you and I are kind of in.
But Hiten, I think that I would, just to say that in the case of Ofqual, the reason we're all talking about it is people cared because it did affect their regular lives and the things they cared about. And I think increasingly the algorithms we're talking about are impinging on things that, you mentioned that we care about, like health, like education, like benefits, the things that day-to-day people across all walks of life need in order to survive and live, employment, all of these areas. So I think if we can, I think, yes, you all here think about it a lot and think about it at a high level, but what we're talking about here does impact, our kids and our, everybody that we live amongst in our neighborhoods. So if we can make that tangible and make it work for everyone, I think everyone should care, and it is interesting, but maybe I'm biased because I write about it all the time.
Well, I certainly agree. It's really, really important, but I think I'm sort of trying to just stress that it's often invisible. It's very rare that it kind of cracks open. You've done great work showing kind of how important it is on, say, facial recognition technology. What we did at the Ada Lovelace Institute was take 50 citizens and work with them over 6 months to really show them what all of this meant, and then now ask them, how would you want this regulated? Where do you see the red lines, as it were? But it's hard to do that at the scale of society, right? So I think that's where it's tricky, and most of us come at these issues not thinking about them across the piece as algorithms. We think about, how is this affecting this particular issue? And often we feel pretty powerless, as it were. So my final point, if I may, is just that it's really important we have civil society, because I, as an individual member of the public, don't have much power. But, if there's an organization that cares about that particular issue, it might be, legal aid or asylum, or it might be, as you say, employment rights. How do we get all those civil society organizations up to speed on these quite technical issues so that they can, represent the public interest?
Yeah, that's a really good segue for Gillian. I'd be curious, Gillian, if you could talk to us about, in the work that you do you think that, or how do you make sure that algorithms going wrong doesn't damage both public and political conversations around benefits of the technology? So, and do you think that it is going to have a long-term effect when we only hear about algorithms going wrong? And is there a way to redress that balance, to be more transparent when algorithms are being used, even when they don't go wrong?
Sure, I think it's a really interesting space, and I do believe that we hear more about them when they go wrong than when they don't. If I look at the work that the Scotland's AI strategy laid out, it talked, its tagline is trustworthy, ethical and inclusive. It's from the government, and indeed the First Minister joined us recently at Data Summit here in Scotland and talked about the importance of using ethical data in policy and decision making in the public sector. And our goal of that strategy is that Scotland will become a leader in the development and use of trustworthy, ethical and inclusive AI. And the data lab and many parts of the ecosystem here in Scotland are fully behind that, including significant citizen and public engagement. So actually there was significant public engagement in the creation of that strategy, multi-generational workshops, open forums, reaching through community groups and others for input. And I think that is really, really important about giving our people a voice. And the strategy really is about having people at its heart. If AI and the use of AI is really about the benefit of people, then if you do that properly, then it will improve, the economy. It will provide a more improved society, and it will help address significant global challenges like climate. But I do think it's critically important to engage citizens in that discussion, and indeed one of the key strands of the strategy is community engagement and ensuring that continually listening to the voices of our society as things develop. It doesn't stand still. The pace of change is very fast. We're also not operating in a siloed environment. This is a global environment with certain regulatory levers and others outside of the control of the Scottish Government, for example. So we have to very much operate in a global environment for that. I think there is a real challenge on trust and trusting from the public, to not just to public sector organisations, but private as well. And let's just say we must never, ever take public trust for granted, and that we must continue to earn it and continue to demonstrate how we're using AI and indeed many other technologies as a driver for benefit for our society.
Gavin, how do you think we separate out the political failures from the failures of the system, so that in the public understanding, we can have an informed conversation about benefits versus risks of AI versus actually this is a political failure here of how something was done, and actually it would have been fine if it had been done in a different way? How do we kind of separate those two strands out?
I think that's a really good question, and I suppose there is a related question, which is to what extent should we separate those things out, given that the choice to use any of these technologies is part of the political decision making, and ultimately, if anything, there are certain things that might go wrong in the deployment that are therefore the result of choosing to use it in the first place, if that sort of makes sense. I think it's about, part of it is about having the regimes in place to help us understand the sort of technical and deployment side a little bit more. And I think it goes to what you and Hiten were discussing as well, that for a lot of people, it will only affect them when it affects them because it's something to do with health or schools or a particular subject area. Whereas for those of us in the public policy community, I suppose we need to be there scrutinising, holding to account, and overseeing what's going on across the piece. I thought something quite interesting on that front was the recent publication of the UK's pilot algorithmic transparency standard, which actually makes a distinction between two tiers of information. One of them is the sort of basic information that you'd want anybody to be able to see, even if they don't have any expertise in algorithms. And then the sort of second tier is that much more detailed technical insight about sort of data sets that are being used, how they're being used, how bias is being mitigated, so on and so forth. So I think those sorts of separations are quite useful, which, bringing us back to your question, is probably there are a set of questions and issues where some of that slightly technocratic oversight is quite useful. But ultimately, you need to be thinking about things like the aim of the policy, the way that government has actually implemented the sort of wider policy and the wider program that gives you a little bit of a distinction between the politics and everything else. But again, you can't completely separate them.
Yeah, Hiten, do you want to jump in there? I'm also curious about we're talking about the negative examples. Do you think that there need to, do you think there kind of evidence of there being a problem in the sector, or do you think this is important to kind of instill a healthy skepticism amongst people?
So I would say, that the power of data to make our lives better is extraordinary. And we just have to look at the pandemic and how we have used data, health data all the way through that in a really, really important way. So I think that's got to be a starting point. But then a question is, with any given situation, who is trying to use the data and for what purpose, as it were? So let's take the justice system as an example, where the court system at the moment, you couldn't, if you ask the Ministry of Justice, how many times did the courts sit during the pandemic? They have no idea. They've got no sense of how many cases were seen or what the outcomes were, et cetera, et cetera. And it would be really important information if we could track some of those things. Now, at the same time, government is interested in trying to use algorithms to improve outcomes in the justice field. If it's just used as a way of trying to cut costs, that is not necessarily going to be useful to us in the long run as a society. Whereas if we're trying to track, is there discrimination in the system? Certain kinds of judgments are not coming out in the right way, et cetera, that seems much more in the public interest. So I think it's that kind of set of public interest tests which is important. But we've got to remember, what are algorithms replacing? It's human judgment, which is not a perfect standard. We mustn't judge algorithms versus a perfect standard, but we do need high standards. And if it's a commercial deployment, you're selling Pop-Tarts, I basically don't really care if your algorithm doesn't work very well. Whereas if you're working in the policy field, it's much higher stakes, and so we need to use higher thresholds. And that's why recent publication that the Ada Lovelace Institute did on algorithmic use in the public sector, we came out with 8 different ways in which you can hold algorithms to account, and that varies from standards all the way through to independent oversight and even moratoria, as we've seen with facial recognition, for example. So there's a variety of interventions, but I think, as Gavin was saying, you can look at that kind of level of how do we hold the algorithm to account, but the kind of wider lens is what is the policy trying to do in the first place, and is that the right thing to be focusing on?
David, do you want to jump in on that? Hiten mentioned the various instruments that could be used to ethically implement algorithms. What do you see as ways that we can do that, but also what policymakers can do to implement those instruments in a way that it actually works or is enforced, or
I think a starting point is not necessarily talking about holding the algorithms to account, but holding those who are behind the use, design, development, and deployment of them to account. I think it's really, there's a sense in which we need to have the producers and users of these systems held in the steering or pole position when it comes to transparency and accountability, and at the same time make 2 moves. First, really prioritize the democratic governance of the systems. So make sure that there is a sufficient degree of public participation and understanding, especially when we have public sector use of AI. So having stakeholders involved in processes of considering whether or not the use as such is justified, or whether or not the choices of the objects of solution are justified. In a sense, having a kind of end-to-end stakeholder involvement, I think, will be one of the first things that really needs to be put in place if we are going to have real transparency and accountability. The second thing is, I think we really need to make a move towards ex ante as opposed to ex post approaches to algorithmic governance, which is to say, up to now, the view on, say, algorithmic impact assessment or algorithmic transparency has really focused on auditing and kind of traceability, rather than a kind of anticipatory reflection that, in a sense, gets out ahead of the decision-making process behind all of the design choices, behind decisions to engage, et cetera, and really has a process by which the trustworthiness and justified trust for a system is evidence-based and properly demonstrable through documentation processes. And so, for instance, the ICO Turing guidance that we put out on explainability really stresses this kind of process level transparency, where we really start to tap into a real accountability in virtue of the demonstration of responsible processes of building and using the systems, rather than looking backwards after things go wrong, getting out ahead so that things can go right.
Right. Before the final section, I want to ask about, which, David has already started talking about, but, how do we move forward? How can we make this work effectively for everybody? How can we educate policymakers? What are the solutions? And do we see any good examples of this elsewhere that we can emulate? But I just want to say that we are also open to questions. I'm not really sure how I'm receiving them, hopefully through the chat. But if anyone has questions, and I hope that you all do, please do ping them our way and I will put them to our panel. Great. So we'll be posting them in the chat, so do send them through, and we'll get to them in the final 10 minutes or so. So we'll have another 5 minutes of discussion, and hopefully as your questions come through, I'll pick them up. So speaking to that last bit about, what you were saying, David, about, transparency, accountability, auditing, all of that really comes under this wider definition of trust and generating public or trust of anybody who uses and implements these systems, right? Gillian, maybe you can jump in on this, but I would really like to hear from everybody. How do we do this? And there are regulations that exist. GDPR under Article 22 requires algorithmic transparency, for example, or redress, but really nobody seems to know. And if they do try and avail of it, it isn't really being enforced. So, how do we use the existing ways that we do have, and how do we create better usable ways to enforce and improve public trust around algorithm use? Gillian, do you want to jump in first?
Sure, and I think the panel actually will have a lot of great input here, particularly the work that Alan Turing, as David said, and Ada Lovelace, as Hiten has said, have been doing a lot in this area. But I think there's multiple areas to look at. One is the education front, as you said. Actually, how do we educate more policymakers, more politicians, and actually just generally increase the education and awareness more broadly in society? I think there's both a regulatory and a legislative framework that needs to be understood how that progresses. Obviously, the EU have published a new white paper, I believe, on where the direction of travel in terms of regulation around AI. And the other thing is, how do we provide tools and toolkits and enablement for the organisations that are participating? How do we give them the capability to be as transparent as possible, to use the right methods to communicate what their algorithms do and how they do it? So I think, across those areas, there's still a long way to go. But I think those are some of the ways, and I'm not saying that's exhaustive, that we can improve.
Okay, thank you. Hiten, do you have any, what are your ideas? How do we
Sure.
solve
Well, I'd agree with Gillian, you need a kind of broad-based approach. So, but just let's kick out a few. One is I suggest focusing more on outcomes than trying to peer into the black box of the algorithm, especially when you've got a machine learning algorithm. It's very hard to make sense of what the code means. So, but if you monitor the impacts, that's a good starting point. Second thought is building capacity across regulators. So when I was saying, across health, education, these things are coming alive, and that's where we care about them. Each of these regulators has not had to deal with this before, and many of them are quite behind the curve. So we need to build their capacity, I think. Then there's something about how we get the public involved. So I think what we did with the biometrics work at Ada we could be doing across the piece in other areas to say, what are the lines that the public want us to draw? And I think they'll be different in different places, and that's a good thing, as it were. And then I think appeals processes and making sure humans are in the loop. So coming back to the off-qual point, the off-qual didn't have a very good appeals procedure, only on technicalities, whereas in Northern Ireland they did, and they were able to pick up some of the outliers, and that was much better, I think. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. David, do you have any views on that?
Sure. I mean, I think we really need to continue to sort of look at the general policy field on AI ethics and governance right now, and see that we're moving towards an increasingly sophisticated approach to, say, ethical or human rights impact assessment for algorithms. So, for instance, the work of the Council of Europe right now, that the Institute's been involved there, where they're really starting to think about what are the instruments that need to be put into place for there to be the kind of needed both transparency, but also even more importantly, continuous accountability when it comes to making those decisions about whether or not the potential risks, the potential adverse impacts of a system justify in the first place the building of the system. Also, I would say
to ask, what about policy methods that actually improve the technical underpinnings of the system? So we've talked a lot about off-qual today because it's a really good example of when the system does go wrong, as Hiten explained, the outliers weren't quite receiving the grades that they otherwise would have. So who's in charge of checking the homework of these algorithms, the outcomes, as we've said? Is there anything in place before it actually starts to change people's lives for someone to say, does this look right? Should we be filtering this? This doesn't seem right, like for human experts to look at it.
We definitely need to strengthen the oversight component, and that will involve strengthening regulatory regimes, strengthening the kind of upskilling and strengthening the levels of readiness across government in order to have the right trusted third parties to actually look in and audit the systems. And we have to remember that in the off-qual situation, there was an opportunity for oversight from I can't remember if it was the Royal Statistical Society or one of the statistical bodies had been involved in potentially looking over that work. But as I recall, just from memory from a year and a half ago or whatever it was, there was a non-disclosure, a demand for a non-disclosure agreement at the time about the algorithm itself, which ended up not being not being acceptable to those who were going to do the oversight. And so we just need to have, I think, as I was saying, more oversight, more skilled oversight, but also a willingness among those who are producing to have their work checked over, as you were saying, in the first instance.
Thank you. And Gavin, just to come in at the end, could you give us some examples of initiatives you've seen around the world, whether that's, the algorithmic registers in Amsterdam and Helsinki, or anywhere that you think, maybe not even to do with AI, in another field, which you think is a good model or a good example of something working effectively, where you can't hide behind, excuses and can actually strengthen trust and increase transparency?
Well, those are actually exactly the examples I was going to go to if you were thinking about the sort of registers-based approach. So I think France and Canada and Amsterdam and Helsinki and various other places are already experimenting with that. And I'm really pleased to see that the UK is going to be piloting that as well. I think the one other thing that I would bring in is actually looking to the United States, not necessarily for what government's doing, but for what we've been seeing from journalism and the media, where you've had organisations like ProPublica, the Markup, who take a real interest and have built a real expertise around reporting on some of these issues. And I think making sure, and we talked a little bit about regulators. I know the Office for Statistics Regulation, for instance, has done some really good work around algorithms and statistical methods, but as well as thinking about how we support regulators and parts of the state to do auditing and accountability work, also thinking about that sort of wider fourth estate, journalism and also civil society, to make sure we've got the capacity to be able to properly scrutinise these things. None of that takes the responsibility off government and its regulatory systems to get this right in the first place, but I think building that wider capacity is really important as well.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience that is really just builds on that, and I'd love any of you to jump in, or all of you. But the question asks, what steps can we take to increase awareness of the general public? So rather than policymakers, just the general public, so that we can engage in these discussions about why they should care and how these topics affect them. Who wants to jump in first? Gavin, go for it.
Thanks. This sort of goes back to Heaton's point earlier, which is, I think some of this will not be by design. It will be as and when events happen and things come up that will suddenly hook the public into various aspects of it. I think we can probably predict one of those for 2022 already. I think there will be quite a bit of discussion around this in the context of the online safety bill, which again sounds like a very policy wonkish answer, but will be less of one when there are headlines about various social media platforms, how we're auditing their algorithms, the access that researchers have to it, the various harms that may be caused there, and also various opportunities that there may be from deploying algorithmic systems in a more positive way. So I think there is a certain extent to which it may be when things come up, we can, and as I said, we can probably predict a few of those. I know that people like Big Brother Watch have been looking into sort of algorithms around work and pensions and benefits, for example. We've obviously had the big education story last year. So it's probably about trying to think where some of those stories might happen, and making sure that those of us who work in public policy are in a position to help the public understand those things as and when things occur. And
yes, Hiten, do jump in.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say, I think that when something's coming alive when it hits popular culture. So, if you've got a character in a soap opera who is complaining about not having got a job because the algorithm turned them down, that's when the story kind of comes alive to a much wider population, I think. So, and we are starting to see novels, being written about AI futures and that kind of thing. So I think the story is now creeping into popular culture in quite an interesting way. And that is a very different narrative to the one that we, who might be thinking about it from a policy perspective, will sort of bring to it.
That's fascinating.
If I could just quickly add one thing to this, which is just that I think we also need to have a kind of active perspective as well, which is to say we need to be out there doing the kinds of public engagement that will lead to higher levels of readiness, more upskilling, more digital and data literacy in the public. And just from the experience of working at the Alan Turing Institute, we've engaged citizens in Manchester, Coventry, in Camden, in basically all over in different levels of society, engaging, for instance, families with lived experience of the social care system and the use of algorithms in social care system. And I can say without exception, there is a sense that when you engage the public and even introduce them to the basics of data and algorithms, there's a transformative effect, and there is a real sense of ownership over some of these decisions that come along with even a minimal amount of upskilling. And so I think we do need to be out there and actively engaging citizens through citizens' assemblies, through other deliberative sorts of engagements. And it's only through that kind of public involvement, public engagement, that we will actually be able to bring a higher consciousness about this to those who are impacted by these systems.
Thank you. I should wrap up there, but I feel like I should give Gillian the last word if she'd like it. Gillian, what's your top way in which you think we get the average woman on the street involved and engaged in algorithms, and why it should affect them or their families?
I wouldn't strongly disagree with the panel. It'll come to the fore when things happen, but I do agree with David is taking the step forward. Actively engage. Yes, we operate in this environment. we communicate, but actually take the opportunity to engage with community groups, to look at what's happening in your own sphere or organisations that are active, and contribute to the discussion. And we definitely saw that here in Scotland through the Children's Parliament, for example, engaging them and the Royal Society of Edinburgh with many public engagement events. So there are organisations at the heart of our community. Use them as a means to help spread awareness, access to education and tools.
Thank you so much. I know we talked about us, people here being policy wonks, but I feel really heartened after this conversation to know that, the four of you are thinking about these issues and obviously have such great, bright ideas of how we're going to bring them to the fore and solve these problems. And I look forward to writing about the impacts and effects of all of the things we've discussed today. Thanks again. And I think there's going to be a short break before the next session at 2:20, which is about regulation, assurance and auditing. And they're going to ask, what role will different approaches to governance play in the future of trustworthy AI? Thanks again for joining.